Hey, what's up, guys? This is a kind of impromptu, potentially low audio quality monologue podcast. I haven't done this in a little bit, and partially it's because I don't know, I kind of give myself a pretty high bar of quality for a lot of the stuff I post in terms of like making sure I have like a good environment for recording and everything like that. But I think the whole point of these is that it's less about of these like monologues and podcasts and stuff is less about, optimizing for the algorithm and more about just kind of more like loosely getting ideas out there, especially ones that take a little bit more, conversational, less scripted, less of a scripted format in order to communicate them. So like, I felt like in the spirit of that, I'll just record this on my phone, and I don't know if it's if it does really poorly. Obviously, I'll learn that maybe there's at least some minimum bar of algorithmic fitness that I need to achieve. But in this case, I'm more interested in just talking about something that's been on my mind for a while that I don't know how easy it'd be to fit into a small video. And that's about haplogroups and their relationship to language families. And I've been interested in ancient genetics in association with historical linguistics for a while now. And I think this is one of those connections that I don't know. It's like hard to talk about sometimes because it's not like a perfect one-to-one correspondence. And in general, like the types of content I make are kind of pretty quick, and it's harder to get into the nuance that's required for a topic like this, especially a lot of things with ancient genetics. But it is something I find so fascinating, and I think a lot of people would benefit from learning about it because it just tells us so much about the history of the spread of culture and languages and how that kind of lines up with like the models that both linguists and archaeologists have made in the past, and new things that we can confirm with like DNA. And so I'm inspired recently because I just listened to a podcast with the geneticist David Reich, who has been kind of spearheading the whole archaeogenetics field, and in doing so has kind of learned, I mean, maybe he already knew a lot of this stuff, but has started talking a lot more about linguistic groups and stuff like that. And so in a way, I see this as an opportunity for linguistics and the study of languages to kind of surface more in popular science, because it's not just about studying people's grammar or the distribution of languages today. It's about history, and it's about like language has always been there, not always, but has been there for the pretty much all of the human story that we know about, as far as we know. So it's really cool to hear people outside of your field casually dropping terms like Indo-European or yada yada yada. And so one thing I thought was kind of just like a general idea that comes out of what ancient genetics has discovered about language groups and language families. The general idea is that languages and DNA overall don't track each other super easily. So in general, like you can drop a baby who's Japanese purely genetically, and then drop them in the United States, and they're going to learn English just as well as any other person born in the United States, and vice versa, and all that. And so like that, there's no like inherent language gene in terms of like a Japanese language gene or an English language gene. I think that's, most of you guys know that, obviously. But another thing is that like language families themselves often contain a lot of genetic diversity. So like even smaller language families, I'm trying to think of like a better example than like, obviously like the one I'm most familiar, the language family most people are most familiar with is the Indo-European language family. But that's potentially not a great, here, I'll just choose a subset of that since I'm more familiar with it, but this applies to other language families. Let's say like the Germanic language branch of the Indo-European languages. Even within that branch, there is a lot of genetic diversity. I mean, there's at least relative to like the rest of Europe, like there's a lot of people with like in Scandinavia with uniquely Scandinavian genetics. There's people in southern Germany with uniquely southern German genetics, and northern Germany, and like if you go if we're talking about England, there's a lot more of like a Celtic substrate in both in the language and genetically, and I say this to just kind of emphasize that like there isn't like a genetic profile for a Germanic speaker. There's not a genetic profile for an Indo-European speaker in terms of like their overall like autosomal DNA. So autosomal is like the majority of your DNA. However, what's interesting about ancient genetics is that although there's a ton of diversity within language families, what often is the case is that there are certain things you can track that actually do correlate very strongly with language families, even though they don't really impact your genetics that much. And you're not gonna it's not gonna be like, ooh, everybody who speaks an Indo-European language has pointy ears or something. Like there's no it's never really gonna code to a feature like that. But there are genes that actually do very strongly track language families, better than basically the rest of your DNA. And these, in general, are haplogroups. So a haplogroup is essentially a grouping that can be made based off of DNA you either get from your maternal line or your paternal line. So if you So your father, if you're a male, passed you a marker for your paternal haplogroup. And if you're female, technically your paternal haplogroup, you didn't receive that gene because you don't have a Y chromosome, and that's where this this paternal line gets passed through. Obviously, if you could receive that as a female, then you would not be able to. Then it would no longer be a paternal line, obviously. But technically, you can by proxy have a paternal haplogroup from your dad. Like you could. I think if you go on like 23andMe or something, it'll tell you that your paternal haplogroup is that of your father. As if you have if you're like connected with your dad on 23andMe or whatever other genetic. I don't know if I'm sure there's plenty of services like that. But anyway, the point is there's certain DNA that you can only get from your paternal line. So that means you had to get it from your dad, and he had to get it from his dad. So it's not like it's not like you could get it from your dad and then he got it from his mom and then his mom got it from her dad. It's like it has to be a direct line of men, of XY chromosomes, and you're just receiving this Y. And so that is how you build a paternal haplogroup. And then there's certain DNA. There's no, obviously, a woman has just two X chromosomes and a man can have those too. So the X chromosome is actually not a unique identifier for a maternal line. But what is actually your mitochondrial DNA. So that's DNA that you get. I believe it comes from like I'm not super well versed in this, but I believe it comes from like the egg. So a fertilized egg, your first cell, it gets that mitochondrial DNA from your mother, and so we can track where your maternal line through that, mitochondrial DNA that only gets passed through eggs. So obviously it couldn't come from your dad. And so basically we have ways of tracking maternal lines and paternal lines. And these are very small portions of DNA. And in the grand scheme of things, they're almost insignificant in terms of the rest of your genome. Obviously, one makes you a man, so it's like that's not insignificant. And obviously your mitochondrial DNA is important, but it's not going to easily distinguish populations if you just look at them phenotypically. You're not going to be like, oh, that guy is so obviously a R1A haplogroup. Like you're only going to guess that if it happens to be correlated with large chunks of autosomal DNA or something like that. And the reason I emphasize that is because, there isn't a single phenotype, appearance or morphology of your body. There isn't a single phenotype associated with language families necessarily. I mean, it could be the case that a lot of them share a lot of autosomal DNA, but there often is a very strong correlation between paternal haplogroups specifically. It's not the case for all language families that it's the paternal side. Sometimes it's actually the maternal side. So for instance, with Austronesian languages, I believe there's a stronger correlation with the maternal haplogroups than there is with paternal haplogroups because they have more matrilineal societies. But in general, in a society like most human societies that has a kind of a specific line, a specific, I guess, like marriage culture, essentially, I'm saying. I just conflated the term patrilineal and patrilocal versus matrilineal and matrilocal. So Austronesian languages have everybody has matrilineal lines and patrilineal lines, obviously, but Austronesian language groups share a matrilineal like DNA more often, or they correlate stronger with their maternal haplogroups because they are a matrilocal society. So matrilocal means that the men move to the house of their mother. So if if you're incorporating new people into your society, their kids are always going to end up getting that DNA from the mothers, that mitochondrial DNA. Whereas if in a patrilineal society, the woman would, or a patrilocal society, the woman would move to the man's house or the father's house of that man, and so then it would lead to that culture preserving male lines better versus a matrilocal society where the female lines would get preserved better. Anyway, a lot of human cultures are like this. I believe it tends to be the default that there is one specific side, whereas it's obviously not like that anymore. But if it's not the default, it's at least very significant, and especially in like agricultural societies and pastoralist societies, it's an extremely strong signal, and particularly with the paternal lines, because that's more of the plurality. It's like it's more common that if a society is patrilocal or matrilocal, it's more common that it's going to be patrilocal. Although that isn't necessarily some like human like biological default, that like we just inherently prefer to have women move to the homes of men, of the fathers or whatever. It actually probably has more to do with specific technological advancements, like the invention of the plow or something that require a lot of like upper body strength and stuff like that, and like agricultural societies tend to be more patrilocal, whereas others don't tend to be as patrilocal. But obviously that is a very widespread cultural technology at this point, or was throughout recent history. So then it appears that it's so much more common to be a patrilocal society, whereas it wasn't necessarily like that in the past. I'm sure that's actually something you could track by looking at seeing how well haplogroups were preserved in ancient skeletons and stuff like that. Anyway, I mean, this is I've been going for 15 minutes just kind of breaking down the ancient DNA side of things, but I think it's really important context, because if it can lead to you better grasping why this could correlate with languages. So also, like, given that I'm more well versed on the linguistic side of things and not necessarily in the archaeogenetics, if you happen to know more about this, definitely leave a comment and clarify anything, because I'm doing my best here. Anyway, obviously, if you're in a matrilocal society, and let's say you're a young man and you're meeting or moving in with your new wife's family, your kids are going to grow up in that environment, right? So your kids are going to probably learn that language. And even if they also learn your language, because obviously kids have probably been bilingual in households where their father and mother have two different native languages. Kids have been bilingual throughout all of human history. But in general, the trend is that over time, that bilingualism is lost, and eventually one of those languages, it becomes the dominant language of that person's descendants. And in that case, it would probably be the language of the maternal line. If you're moving in with your wife's family, eventually all your kids are going to have that maternal mitochondrial DNA and probably share that, because there's less diversity in terms of the maternal DNA, since all these women are from around there, right? They didn't travel around. They're not from other places. They've stayed. They're matrilocal. They've stayed where they are. So you're not going to have a lot of diversity in the mitochondrial DNA. So all your kids are probably going to have a very similar mitochondrial DNA, unless there's been some mutation or something. And they're also probably going to share that language. And so even though you're a guy from outside and you're introducing diversity of the paternal haplogroup, the fact that they're just staying put is going to lead to that culture having a consistent maternal haplogroup and language. Obviously, that is a very huge oversimplification. There's so many things that can mess that up. They can mess up that correlation, but that is, that's where this starts. That's how this correlation develops. And with, as I was saying, more commonly, with patrilocal societies, you can really see this, this correlation. And there's a large predictive value in knowing somebody's, paternal haplogroup in terms of guessing what language family their language is from. It is far from random guessing. If you know somebody's paternal haplogroup, it's even within a specific region where obviously it had to have been from, you're gonna have a pretty good guess at what their paternal or what their language family is. So, for instance, Finnish people actually just recorded a video for this. So maybe by the time this is out, you'll actually be able to see the video I'm referencing. But Finnish people are genetically very much European. They look very similar to Europeans, and I think it's 90 to 95, 98%, like a huge portion of their DNA is just, especially in terms of their autosomal DNA, is just local. It's just European. So they, if you look at a Finnish person, you're not going to be like, ooh, like sometimes people kind of notice, this looks slightly like Eastern or whatever. Like, but realistically, a lot of times you're probably just kind of almost like hallucinating that, because you kind of, if you already know about the history of like Uralic languages and stuff like that. And I'd say that in general, you can't really tell that a Finnish person is different from like a Swedish person or something like that. Although that's from, somebody from the United States who's not very familiar with these cultures and maybe other things that would cue you in a little bit more. But the Finnish haplogroups, though, a very common haplogroup, I believe it's like somewhere between like 40 and 60% of the population shares this paternal haplogroup, is not the same as the rest of their European neighbors. And it is I think in the video is N1C is that haplogroup. That haplogroup is from like basically like Northeast Asia. It's from like Siberia. And this is actually something that was recently discovered. It was that haplogroup is essentially tracked to ancient skeletons from all the way out there. And the only other people that really consistently share this are other Uralic speakers, other speakers of Uralic languages. And so despite the fact that they're genetically very similar to their neighbors, and despite the fact that they're so far away, they still share this paternal haplogroup that is very unique to Uralic languages. And I just think that is so fascinating, and there's a lot of examples of this, and it's not perfect, but for certain migrations where it was very much it's spread by patrilocal societies, and it's ironically patrilocal, but also the men were the ones doing the migrating and starting these new like offshoots of their culture. So like Indo-European migrations were like this as well. There's very strong correlation between Indo-European languages and the R1 haplogroups. Paternal haplogroup like R1A and R1B, I believe, are the ones that are most strongly associated with that. So they're patrilocal societies, meaning that when these men are taking wives, the wives are coming with them, but they're also sometimes on the move, especially with pastoralist societies, or nomadic societies like the Uralic speakers or pastoralists like the Indo-European speakers. So the men are moving, but the women are moving with them, I guess, is basically how it worked in these situations. And so what that led to is, there's a lot of mitochondrial DNA diversity. There's a lot of different female haplogroups, but there's very low male haplogroup diversity. And So within these cultures, the language was getting passed on from the men who are staying put, not actually staying put, but like they're staying put at least within the context of their culture. Even so, if it's a mobile culture, they're still with that culture. Whereas the women were outsiders often, and so they would be integrated into the society, and then their kids would eventually speak the man's language. Again, they might have been bilingual at first. There might even be multiple generations of bilingual. There might even be centuries of bilingualism. But eventually the whoever's local, patrilocal or matrilocal, that's whose language sticks on, and often that's whose haplogroup becomes associated with that linguistic group. And so what's cool about this situation is it allows for us to understand why, somewhere like Europe can be relatively genetically homogenous in the grand scheme of things. People look or are more genetically similar than you'd think in the grand scheme of things in Europe than other places in the world. So it allows for that. So we understand that many Europeans just share most of their DNA. But it also allows for them to have specific tracers and markers of their linguistic origins. So obviously, with the difference between Uralic speakers and Indo-European speakers, although technically, I think Hungarians are an exception to this, where they actually just really, over time have just lost. They're so far from their the origin of I guess the Uralic homeland or whatever, that the haplogroup has just gradually gotten beaten out by local haplogroups or local paternal haplogroups in Europe. But you can see the same thing with Turkic languages. So like those are the result of male patrilocal migrations where they came as far west as Anatolia, Turkey, and those societies led to large amounts of women being integrated into these Turkic speaking households, and then their kids speaking Turkic languages, but having potentially a lot of over time a lot of autosomal DNA from the local population. So similar to like maybe less extreme, but it's similar to like the situation with Finns. I believe people in Turkey have a large amount of DNA from Turkey, from Anatolia, that's been there for centuries or millennia. So very much, I guess they would say autochthonous is a term that's often used, like just been associated with that land for a long time. However, they speak a language that actually has less of that historical precedent in that area, at least if you just really zoom out. I mean, it's been there for centuries, but I'm talking about like if you really zoom out, it leads to a situation where basically people in Turkey are relatively similar to people in other countries that don't share a Turkic language, that speak a Indo-European language or whatever else, North African language potentially. But they have a Turkic language which is from out east, and they have these haplogroups that are also associated with Turkic languages. So paternal haplogroups. So you can use, so despite being very genetically similar to their neighbors and I guess genetically local, they're linguistically, I don't want to say foreign because that makes it seem like they don't have like, I don't know, like a right to be there. Obviously, that's is where these topics get really hard to say in like a short form video, where it seems like you're threatening someone's national identity or whatever. Like obviously all linguistic everybody's current linguistic situation is a result of some sort of migration. Like Indo-European languages were very much a invasive thing in Europe. So like I think every Indo-European speaker is technically speaking a language that's foreign to Europe. If you zoom out enough, you can say the same thing about many language families, pretty much all language families. So that's not. I'm not trying to criticize anybody's right to a language's right to their homeland. That's I hope you guys are charitable enough with me about about these kinds of topics where I'm not going to come or be like clip farmed into saying something like that. Anyway, you can use ancient DNA to track language migrations because we know that in patrilocal or matrilocal societies, the language often follows the haplogroup, whether that be a maternal or paternal haplogroup. And this is huge. Like this is insane. And there's going to be a lot of stuff. There's going to be a lot of new papers about this throughout the next 5 years, 10 years. And we're going to learn a lot about ancient migrations and ancient groups, a lot more than we even have already. Like the recent video I made about Uralic languages potentially becoming from a different place than linguists originally thought. Like that's not to like criticize the linguistic techniques that were used to predict that the Uralic Urheimat was in the Ural Mountains or whatever. And in fact, the fact that the reasons that linguists thought that actually might still be entirely relevant to providing a more nuanced picture of Uralic migrations. Like for all we know, that's the Ural Mountains were actually like a really important stop on this migration of people from all the way from Siberia. So it's the linguistic data just is going to be continually relevant, and especially when integrated with this archaeogenetics data. But the idea is we're going to learn a lot. Like and the fact that there's this correlation and it's not perfect, or the fact that there's this correlation is really cool, even if it's not perfect. So basically, it's like if you have two competing theories for a language's origin, and one of the theories tracks a lot better with the paternal haplogroup, that doesn't mean that theory is correct. But if you know that it's a patrilocal society and you're just trying to choose which one you're going to bet on, it's probably going to be better to bet on the one that correlates strongly with the paternal haplogroup or whatever. So like that, these are kinds of things that there is a growing, I guess, database of these correlations. They're the kinds of things that you can start to make generalizations about without being too confident and without being certain about any of this. But it is I think it's something that's important to point out as we continue to integrate archaeogenetic data with linguistic predictions. And so if you're trying to, I don't know, if we're trying to reanalyze like old linguistic theories, I think this is an important component. I think this is an important component to integrate into our theories and to take seriously, because this isn't just like people trying to like reinvent linguistics. It's adding like a very important layer to these discussions that I think is really informative and can potentially help us answer linguistic questions, or like start to answer linguistic questions about times where we really can't reconstruct the language. It's too far back. There's no written record. Like we can start to at least have a hazy picture of the linguistic situation of different parts of the world before we have any way of knowing what the language was, before what it sounded like, before we're able to even reconstruct. Like we're going to be able to make educated guesses, not super confident and whatever, but like the 10,000 year hard line, or not hard line, but like essentially like limit that has been historically part of the reconstructive method. It's essentially like comparative reconstruction of languages really just gets really hard after about 10,000 years in the past. That hard line is still going to be there. It's in terms of confident claims about languages relatedness and all that, but it's not like beyond that we have nothing. Like we have something. We have tools, and associating languages with haplogroups and with archaeological cultures and stuff like that allows us to make better guesses than random. And I think that's what I'm trying to emphasize here. It's like we're not like at a loss for words, no pun intended, that far back. Like we have like actual reasons to maybe bet on one theory over another. Anyway, this is just kind of, obviously very freeform, ranty, but I think it's so cool, and I'm nerding out about it a lot recently, so I figured might as well share what my like first impressions are about some of this recent stuff I've been reading up on, and then one other thing I wanted to add was like that there are other ways to track I guess like ancient languages other than just figuring out which paternal line or which parent line it came down with, and then just like assuming that is like that's the only thing that's important, and whatever was there before got erased. There are ways to learn about what the languages there before were, and a lot of what you can do is in a patrilineal society or patrilineal language correlation or whatever, you can still kind of make educated guesses about what the language of the mothers was probably like, based off of the ways that the language changes. Because if we're talking about, the autosomal DNA of the local populations really getting, potentially almost completely overwhelming the incoming DNA in a lot of situations, like I was talking about with like Finnish and stuff. If we're talking about that, then you can also understand that or reasonably guess that this would there'd probably be at least some impact on the language, right? Like in a lot of ways you can track this with loanwords and stuff, but also there's theories that the substrate, which is that would be like the language that's getting replaced, actually can have a large phonetic impact on the new incoming language. So like, the woman moves to the man's family's house, and their kids maybe are slightly bilingual, but eventually their descendants all speak the man's language. I mean, that period of bilingualism, and especially if we're talking about a lot of, this pattern repeated over centuries with local women getting or mixing in with the incoming men. I mean, that can have a large impact on a language. And so just because the language is descended from and is associated with this paternal line does not mean that there's no way to understand what was there before, and does not mean that there was no influence from these the maternal component here, or vice versa with if it was a matrilocal society. And it's especially prevalent with the maternal side of things, though, because children learn their first words from their mother. So even if their mother is speaking the father's language, she's going to speak it with an accent, right? And that kid's going to pick up on that. And if you have a very extreme situation here where a lot of kids are learning from mothers with accents like this over centuries, I mean, that has an impact on the language, and the language can overall start to sound more like whatever the language was before, even if it is genetically, like phylogenetically descended from the paternal line. So, I mean, there's a lot of theories, and these are often more speculative because there's not like this tracer die as it's sometimes called. They can easily track, but it's part of the theory for why there's why like Indo-European languages started sounding the way they did in different places. You can obviously see why it's no coincidence that like the Indo-Aryan branch of Indo-European languages, which is in South Asia, like modern day Indian subcontinent. It's no coincidence that they have retroflex consonants when we know that the Dravidian languages that were already there also had retroflex consonants. Like we're talking about women who were learning in Indo-European languages but had a Dravidian accent, or to oversimplify things, and that has an impact over time, like that, and you can make so that is like one of the clearest situations. You could also assume that similar things happened in different places in different linguistic migrations where there's large changes to the Indo-European sound structure when the Germanic branch, which is that's the source of English, when that was formed. And for all we know, that was just basically a foreign accent that gradually got like codified into the linguistics identity of Germanic speakers who often share this paternal haplogroup associated with Indo-European languages almost always, and actually still have a decent amount of autosomal DNA associated with Indo-European speakers as well. But they also have a lot of local DNA which was also the result of a migration as well. Like they're called the early European farmers, but a lot of Germanic speakers have like DNA from these early European farmers, and that's probably where a lot of these maternal haplogroup diversity comes from. And it is entirely possible that some of these early European farmers, when they learned, Indo-European, the Germanic branch of Indo-European, they started pronouncing things weird, and that's what led to Grimm's Law or whatever. Like this is, I'm speculating, but I think it's also an important layer of this is that you can kind of think of it as like, one side's providing potentially the patrilocality or matrilocality and the phylogenetic origin of the language, and the other might be providing some local loanwords and also like potentially an accent and a phonetic component. So these are things that you can kind of allow us to reach further back in time in linguistic history and make educated guesses that aren't educated guesses in the same way as like this culture had pots really similar to this culture, therefore they might have shared the language. It's not that exactly that type of educated guess, but they're still a lot better than random guesses. So anyway, this is a little bit of a caffeine fueled whirlwind tour of ancient DNA and language families, and what I'm really excited about. So I've already talked about some of this stuff even in previous episodes of this podcast, which I haven't done for a while, but I've been thinking about it more recently, and I don't know. I think it is cool to combine these two fields. I think in my shorts sometimes, because it allows me to teach about things that I know a lot about that are well established in linguistics, while also introducing like this this new research component side of things, where you get to learn about stuff that didn't exist a year ago, or data that didn't exist a year ago. So it's not just like this is an active. Of course, there's actual like linguistic papers coming out as well, but for some of these topics about historical linguistics, there has been a consensus for a while, and it's not like there's going to be some groundbreaking thing that says like Germanic languages actually come from the Italic family or something. Like a lot of that stuff's not going to change, but the ancient DNA is more likely to lead to some of these like groundbreaking holy shit, like I didn't realize that was possible theories, and so I want to keep integrating that into my videos when possible. And here's just kind of. This is just kind of a whirlwind tour of what that's like right now, that field's like, and why it should be interesting to you if you're interested in historical linguistics. So yeah, that's about all I got here. Definitely, if you know more about some of these topics, or if I just made any other types of errors, let me know in the comments. I think these are the comment section for these videos in the past has been awesome. Like it's like I learned so much from you guys, and if all I'm doing is just getting a cool conversation started in the comments, like I'm happy with that too. So hopefully the audio quality here wasn't too bad. I'll see maybe if there's a way to clean it up, but sometimes that can kind of just honestly make it harder to hear what I'm saying, even if it's like maybe potentially in the optimal frequencies or whatever. All right, Nardi out.